So I have the pleasure to present our guest today, which is Peter Gatrell, and I'm very honored to be able to present you, to have you here. That's really a great pleasure for every one of us. In this migration history talk series that we do jointly with the nccr, the National Competence Center on the Move, history on migration on the move, and the history department of the University of Neuchâtel. So Peter Gatrell studied and obtained his PhD at the University of Cambridge, was appointed in 1976 at the University of Manchester, where he spent almost his entire academic career, and where he is Professor Emeritus now since 2021. He originally was a historian of Eastern Europe, the economic and social history of Russia, and then got increasingly interested in the history of refugees, population exchange and displacement, first with respect to Russia, then in Europe in general. And today he is one of the leading historians on this topic. His research interests include 19th and 20th century Russian history, European economic history, the social and cultural history of modern war, and the history of mass population displacement. Finally, the international refugee regime in the 20th century. Peter Gatrell was a founding member of the University of Manchester's Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. He directed several collaborative research projects, including the research project Reckoning with Refugeedom, Refugee Voices in Modern History, 1919 to 1975. And some of our students here have read the paper he co-authored with Alex Dovak, Aninditya Ghoshal, Katerine Novak, Reckoning with Refugeedom, Refugee Voices in Modern History, which came out in 2021 in Social History. Peter Gatrell is a fellow of the British Academy, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He has published several monographs on the economic and on the migration history of Central and Western Europe, such as The Tsarist Economy, A Whole Empire Walking, Refugees in Russia During the First World War, and Free World, the campaign to save world's refugees 1956 to 1963, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2011. The most read book by our students, which are interested in migration and refugee history, are most certainly The Making of the Modern Refugee, which came out in 2013 with Oxford University Press, and The Unsettling of Europe, The Great Migration, 1945 to the Present, which came out in 2019. There's also a long list of books and papers, edited books and papers, from which I would like to mention The Epic and the Domestic Women and War in Russia, and Evidence, History and the Great War, Historians and the Impact of 1914 to 1918. And of course, a paper on the history of refugees, what's wrong with history, which we read with some of our students, and the paper which is in the center today, Raw Material when HCR's individual case files as a historical source. And yeah, I think we will hear more about that. Thank you very much for coming. We are really honored, and to this camera you should talk in.
Yes, well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And I should apologize for speaking in English. I really feel it's a bit shameful, but not all of the material that I consult is in English. So I have a slight get out clause there. And thank you to, particularly to Jean-Thomas, where's Jean-Thomas? Yeah, for helping to organize this event, and to Ramon Videker for his comments subsequently. And I do have this paper, which is a work in progress. And if anyone wants to see the current version, please let me know by email. I'm happy to share it. I've called it Appointment in Geneva, Refugees' Encounters with UNHCR, 1951 to 1975. It draws upon something like 23,000 individual case files that are held by UNHCR records and archives, covering the first 25 years of its existence. And essentially what it does is seek to understand what refugees said about their predicament and what help they sought from UNHCR. So you could think of this as a kind of contribution to the social and indeed the cultural history of population displacement, drawing upon primary printed sources rather than oral history. It's no longer possible to interview refugees at that point in time, displaced before or during or immediately after the Second World War. But what I think it can do is to explore the significance of the moment of encounter between refugees and officials and the traces that they left behind in the archival record. So it's partly about refugee voices. It's partly about the context in which refugees spoke, but it's also about what one might in shorthand call the power relations that were in play. So the case files essentially were created in order for UNHCR to determine the eligibility of refugees to be recognized as such. Who was deemed eligible, from the Latin, who was deemed worthy of recognition and who was not. From a historical point of view, I'm impressed by the remarks of Didier Fassin, who was devoted a lot of time to considering what he calls the daily work of officers and magistrates confronted with concrete cases. And my reading of the historical material is informed by the realization that for countless refugees today, these are matters of life and death. But there are relatively few studies of these procedures around refugee determination in the past. And one thinks, for example, of studies of the International Refugee Organization in 1946 to 1951, which was the predecessor of UNHCR, in which historians are beginning to look at the way in which they reach decisions about persecution of refugees and the decisions that they reached at this point in time. Now I don't need to look at myself on camera. I can just concentrate on my papers. But that then brings me on to questions of access and disclosure. Since my access to these case files, which are confidential, is conditional on not photographing material, on respecting the anonymity of the individuals concerned. So it's privilege, but it's also seductive, because here am I coming close to the spoken word, as it were, of refugees in the past. Stephen Greenblatt, the literary scholar, has written, I wanted to find in the past real bodies and living voices. And if I knew that I couldn't find these, I could at least seize upon those traces that seemed to be close to actual experience. So I think I understand what he means, but I'm also unsettled by the ironic realization that refugees had already rehearsed their stories to UNHCR eligibility officers, often under conditions of duress, and are now in turn disclosing those stories to me without being able to give their permission. Am I not also an intruder? So I speak of individual case files, but what does this mean in terms of understanding this core institution, UNHCR, that forms part of what's come to be called the International Refugee Regime? It's an invitation to think about UNHCR in terms of institutional behaviour, not just towards states, but towards refugees. And the discussion of cases by its staff members was not just anecdotal, but pivotal in terms of guiding its deliberations and creating precedent. This makes me think about the encounter between UNHCR and refugees and how the organisation thought and rethought its mandate in response to the approaches made by refugees. I'm mindful of key questions. Who was allowed to say what, to whom, under what conditions, on what terms? I'm also conscious of gaps and silences, including silences about outcomes, something very close to my thinking at the moment, that we often find when reading these case files that they kind of evaporate without any clear outcome being recorded. Did refugees filter their stories or fashion them to fit the requirements of the refugee regime? Did the institutional constraints imposed on refugees produce a brief record to satisfy a legal bureaucratic requirement? Or were refugees able to provide a fuller account of their displacement? So I want to begin by saying something about UNHCR and indeed about Geneva, and then coming, as it were, closer to refugees. So, as many people will know, UNHCR was established by the United Nations at the end of 1950, initially for 3 years, with a mandate to provide international legal protection for recognised refugees who had crossed an international frontier and who were not to be returned to their country of origin where they faced persecution, the principle of non-refoulement. But being non-operational, it relied upon NGOs to implement programs of assistance and resettlement, or indeed repatriation, and hence it cultivated relationships with other agencies, many of them also in Geneva. It acted cautiously, lest it be accused of undermining state sovereignty. To maintain funding, it had also to demonstrate its fitness for purpose. Like its predecessor, the IRO, it canvassed solutions to the refugee problem, I'm using scare quotes here, in post-war Europe. It didn't comment directly on the root causes of displacement, although because persecution was one of the defining features of the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, it could scarcely evade politics from that point of view. Well, there's of course a historiography on UNHCR as an institution. I won't go into that at this point, though I can talk about it in Q&A. But there is a literature that describes it in terms of what is called institutional timidity, or being restrained in its initial profile, certainly until the late 1970s. So think of this, if you like, as a kind of timidity or an interpretation of UNHCR as timid in the time period that I'm looking at. Thereafter, according to political scientists such as Michael Barnett and others, UNHCR became increasingly complicit with states that prioritized containment and repatriation rather than humanitarian protection, and it supported development projects in host states, assuming the functions of what is sometimes called a surrogate state. Among recent work, I should mention work, including by people in Neuchâtel, about the inner workings of UNHCR and current determination procedures. And the new anthropology of bureaucracy seems to me a promising line of inquiry, since it invites a consideration of what is happening at ground level, including how officials describe their role. But here I'm more interested in the dynamic interaction between UNHCR officials and refugees over issues of recognition. Who learned what and from whom? So then, coming a bit closer to Geneva itself, who sat in judgment? And here, at the moment, I have more questions than answers. What was their background? I'm talking about the officials who create the record and make a record in the case files. How were they recruited? What did they earn? What pension did they receive? What hours did they earn? How did they treat fellow employees? What of their life beyond the office? What kind of a place was Geneva in the 1950s and the 1960s? What newspapers did they read? How did they spend their leisure time? What did they think of their job? At this stage, I can say that some UNHCR staff members had worked for previous organisations devoted to the protection of refugees, including the IRO. Most were likely appointed by word of mouth. They had temporary contracts because UNHCR itself was subject to renewal every so often. And it was a small world, mainly but not exclusively masculine. One official called John Kelly described a small number of desk officers in Geneva and said, quote, "We were all lawyers. We handled legal protection ourselves and enjoyed enormous authority." But then one of the interesting things that begins to emerge out of the case files is that UNHCR grew and it established branch offices. So it spread, as it were, from Geneva outwards to Europe and further afield. And this proliferation had the potential to generate friction. In a case file from 1970, for example, this concerns a South African refugee who wanted to move from Kenya to Zambia. UNHCR tore a strip off its branch officer in Nairobi for having supported him. If Mr. BP, the man in question, the official in question, if Mr. BP is going to make it easy for refugees to move about from country to country without making sure they would be welcome in the countries they intend to go to, we may have a new crop of problems, not only of legal protection, but also of allowances for subsistence, etc. And another instance relating to a student activist from Cameroon who took refuge in Ghana, this led Geneva to complain that its office in Accra had been too quick to validate his account of persecution, giving him the benefit of the doubt for the time being. And this was tantamount, it said, to declaring him a refugee. And so the relationship between UNHCR and its local branches in this early period will repay closer study. Perhaps local officials thought that decisions at the centre were being taken by lawyers who interpreted cases too rigidly. And I'm keeping an open mind about that. But then refugees, their initial approach and the kinds of response that they gained when they made an approach to Geneva. There's a cross-section of the case files. Many of them concerned elderly Russians, for example, in China, who asked to be resettled in Western Europe or Australia to live out the rest of their days in relative comfort. Hungarian refugees are well represented after 1956, but there are numerous other cases of East Europeans before 1956 as well as after. By the 1960s, refugees in sub-Saharan Africa, mainly young men, asked about student bursaries to continue their education abroad. Other refugees, they kind of exist in sort of fragments, much less numerous. Jews from Iraq, refugees from Haiti, for example. So they crop up intermittently. But because the files end in 1975, when UNHCR archives moved to a different system of record keeping, what you don't find is refugees from East Asia coming up in the case files. But there are one or two instances where unexpected refugees, so to speak, crop up, and I'll mention one or two in a moment. The encounter between refugees and the UNHCR was usually virtual. That's to say, refugees wrote letters and petitions or completed templates issued by voluntary organisations in advance of resettlement. These forms asked for the bare minimum, name, family, date of place of birth, and so forth. But refugees or aid workers sometimes provided more detail. In other words, not all refugees were governed or bound by the restrictions of the formulaic template that was placed in front of them. There were letters obviously written in languages other than English, French, German. Where they were written in Hungarian or Russian, for example, they were translated and usually abbreviated by UNHCR translators. And that whole question of translation is something that I think needs to be looked at more carefully. Some encounters took place face to face. Refugees turn up, as it were, on the doorstep in Geneva or in branch offices. But the route to Geneva was often circuitous. That's to say, refugees approached UNHCR indirectly as well as directly. They appealed to the United Nations Secretary General or to prominent figures. So you find examples in the case file of refugees writing to General de Gaulle or to Eleanor Roosevelt, Princess Grace of Monaco, Yul Brynner, the well-known Hollywood actor who gave his name to the campaign for World Refugee Year in 1960. So you find that refugees wrote to prominent celebrities or people in high office, and those letters are rerouted to UNHCR in Geneva. And some refugees bypassed the bureaucratic labyrinth altogether and appealed directly to the High Commissioner, mentioning a personal relationship, either with him or another staff member. As far as the gender of refugees is concerned, as represented in the case files, I can only offer a rough and ready calculation. My sense is that women are outnumbered by men by a factor of about 4. But of course, that makes it all the more interesting when women are writing on behalf either of themselves or their families, or indeed, in some cases, writing many years later about the violence that they encountered, had been inflicted on them during the Second World War. So very painful cases that you sometimes read. Some were tracing requests. I want help in locating family members. They were often rerouted to the Arolsen archives. Some were about family reunion. Many of them were about obtaining travel documents, which UNHCR then passed over to other organizations since it didn't issue travel papers on its own account. As far as the experiences of refugees are concerned, there's an enormous amount of very compelling, poignant testimony in which refugees describe the impact of Nazism, the Holocaust. They stretch back to accounts of the Armenian genocide, looking at elderly Armenians who were harking back to the events of 1915. There are plenty of echoes, as you would expect, of the Revolution Civil War in Russia, as well as the upheavals in East Europe after 1945. And there are also cases that disclose evidence of colonial violence and freedom struggles in sub-Saharan Africa, the civil war in Nigeria being a case in point, post-colonial struggles and upheavals in places like Rwanda and Tanzania. And what this suggests, this kind of diversity of accounts, what it suggests to me is that from the perspective of UNHCR, some of these events were relatively more familiar than others. They could, as it were, relate to the Holocaust or to Nazism more easily than they could to emerging accounts from younger African students who were living in Tanzania or Ghana or elsewhere, including in Europe, of course. But in every respect, it seems to me, the case files provide a kind of history of the 20th century. There are numerous startling accounts of wartime persecution, civil war, incarceration, including in refugee camps in post-war Europe, rape, exploitation, local hostility, a litany, in other words, of the injuries inflicted on people, including those who fell outside the mandate, but who hoped that UNHCR could nevertheless intervene. Listen to the account of 1956 of a woman called Ellie, who wrote, "We are refugees from the Eastern Zone. They'd been living in Lower Saxony for 11 years. Her husband was a house painter and a decorator, couldn't find work, especially in the winter." And she went on, "Despite Germany's economic recovery, I have to buy offal from the butcher in order to have something to cook." She went on to detail her household budget and added that my 14-year-old boy has to be confirmed on the 25th of March. I do not know for the life of me where I will get shoes, clothes, underwear for him. It's enough to drive me out of my mind. She'd written to the German Chancellor, to Parliament in Bonn, but as she said, all we get are soothing words and further delays. Please help us to live instead of merely exist. UNHCR simply wrote a standard acknowledgement on the grounds that her case was in the hands, or should be in the hands, of the German government. But it's an interesting case to me, an interesting instance of the widespread belief that UNHCR could be a potential site of redress. Then there are numerous descriptions of complicated odysseys. 54-year-old Joseph approached UNHCR in 1966 on the grounds that he'd been persecuted during the Second World War because, as he put it, he was, quote, part Jewish. The IRO had resettled him in Cuba in 1948 and he received a Cuban passport. But in 1962, he left for Argentina and then Chile before deciding, in his words, to, quote, roam around the world a bit. He entered Tanzania without a visa in 1965. He married an unnamed Italian woman and they had 2 children. By 1966, he was dividing his time between friends and living with his parents-in-law in Tanzania. UNHCR rebuffed his application because he didn't qualify for refugee status, as he was, in their words, an illegal immigrant. But for the historian, the story he recounted, the Odyssey, is at least as compelling as the verdict. And then there are the stories that emerge in the case files of anti-colonial struggle. In 1961, a Mozambican refugee wrote at length to explain, quote, I'm Adelimo. I'm 22, born and educated in the colony of Mozambique, Portuguese East Africa, described province by Portugal. Yet there's worse discrimination, injustice, cruelty, and government of dictator Salazar, the criminal one in the world. I'm a refugee from where I escaped when my life was in danger. He had been imprisoned by the Portuguese authorities because he'd been a member of the political organization that subsequently became Frelimo, and he'd fled to Tanzania. Since, he said, since the work of your organization is known as the helpful one, advising, aiding, and other kinds of help to human beings, which includes especially refugees, he wanted UNHCR to help fly him to New York, where at the UN he proposed to report how all I suffered and what I want in future for my country. This is slightly colloquial English. All I want in future for my country. I'd like to meet the members of the General Assembly before its end, explaining all. And he signed off, yours in seek of freedom. UNHCR dismissed his request. As the office said, it's obvious upon reading this letter that Mr. G is not a refugee. Our office cannot be involved in the internal affairs of a country. So UNHCR in this instance rejected his request to publicize colonial repression on an international stage rather than alienate its paymasters. supporting the argument, if you like, about institutional timidity. But there were also signs of a willingness to be more open-minded, to stretch a point, if you like. Where unusual circumstances tested interpretations of the mandate, refugees had to be persistent. An unusual example from 1970 concerned 27-year-old Palestinian Abdullah F., who'd been studying economics in Delhi for several years. His quarrel was with the government of Jordan, and it's what he called discriminative and hostile attitude towards the Palestinians in general and towards me in particular. So interesting that he's, as it were, linking his own predicament, as it were, to a general cause. I personally, he said, did not opt for Jordanian passport. I was forced to accept it, as I had no other travel document to go abroad to study. Your office, he said, helps defectors from the east to the west, because they differ ideologically from their governments. Here, I differ politically with Jordan. It's not my country, nor my government. So why should I not be helped? I differ with Israel for its theocratic ideology and forcible occupation of my country. Therefore, I cannot go there. Please think again of me as a Palestinian and a Palestinian refugee only. Nothing else. Trying to build myself to be able to exist. Well, as you will well know, I guess, Palestinian refugees came under an entirely different organization, under the aegis of the UN RWA, Relief and Works Administration for Palestinian, Agency for Palestinian Refugees. So a clear response would be to say, Palestinian, we'll pass this over to UNRWA, to the other organization. But Abdullah was persistent. He wanted to ingratiate himself with UNHCR's representative in Delhi. He invited him to dinner. I intend, he said, to get some Arabic dish prepared especially for you. I feel we should meet more often because I feel totally relaxed and pleased when we are together. So UNHCR at first said, back you go to Jordan, but then it had a change of heart. It said the facts as now presented put a different complexion on the matter altogether. By his participation in demonstrations and the general hostile attitude of the ambassador, Jordanian ambassador in Delhi, following the events in Jordan of the past few months, there can be little doubt that he would fear persecution in Jordan. It was altogether a remarkable case. Abdullah's perseverance, his knowledge of the international refugee regime, his attempt to cultivate a personal relationship with someone in authority, his insistence on being recognized as a Palestinian refugee, and UNHCR's decision to accept his eligibility on grounds of persecution. I then wanted to say something about an issue that I find particularly rewarding to think about, which is the kind of tone and the tactics that refugees adopted. You might expect, and you wouldn't be surprised to find, that a lot of statements are made in what one might call supplicatory mode. Please help me. I beg you to help me. As one Albanian refugee put it in 1965, I am sure, dear sir, you can imagine my actual situation if you put yourself only for a moment in my place. Richard, a Congolese refugee living a hand-to-mouth existence in Uganda, contacted UNHCR in 1969. Here I am, at last, on my knees before the High Commission. Many others referred to the sacrifices they had made and appealed to Geneva for mercy. But some, like Richard himself, also astutely adopted, or if you like, mimicked, the bureaucratic language of UNHCR. And he made sure to head his letter Objet, Lettre de rappel et rapport. And he followed up later with a 3-page letter, which he titled My Reference, 002, etc., 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 mimicking the bureaucratic formula. Then I came across case files in which refugees deployed sarcasm, if you like, as a kind of weapon of the weak, to coin a phrase. Hungarian refugee Joseph K. wrote from an address in Ankara to the then High Commissioner Sadruddin Aga Khan as follows. Pardon me for taking the liberty to write. I know that you, being a prince and High Commissioner, have many problems and would hardly bother about the problems of a mere refugee. I have little hope that you will read my letter. Mr. Schindler, this is the UNHCR delegate in Turkey, Mr. Schindler is a big man. Why should he be concerned with the problems of a little man like me? He is a busy man. He has important duties like cocktails and social gatherings and parties. I trusted Mr. Schindler because he has a manner of speech which inspires confidence at first. Anyway, I was fooled. Having helped him to resettle in an old people's home in Switzerland, Geneva then sent a stern note to Schindler, another instance, if you will, of a kind of institutional friction. And then there's another case which I particularly like from a Serbian-born journalist who'd been living in Switzerland since 1945, was recognized as a refugee, and sent a series of typewritten letters to the High Commission in 1957, protesting that he was being harassed by the police and the local tax officer. And it includes this gem, if you'll pardon my pronunciation. Je suis pas un collectionneur d'autographes. Je n'aspire qu'à une vie calme. Je n'aime pas importuner les gens par des lettres comme celle-ci, et je n'aime surtout pas parler de moi-même. Ceci dit, lorsque je m'adresse au chef d'une institution, c'est parce que je juge son intervention être indispensable. So he didn't want to kind of go on just collecting signatures, but he also had a serious point to make. He acknowledged that UNHCR had devoted plenty of attention to Hungarian refugees in 1956. He was of a previous vintage. And he speculated that the fathers and the brothers of Hungarian refugees who were refugees in 1956, that they had probably played a role in occupying his country during the Second World War, Serbia. Lindt, who was the High Commissioner at this time, attempted to mollify him by replying that the individual emigration of refugees raises numerous problems. Each case had to be carefully scrutinized and subject to numerous démarches. He added, neither I nor my office has the capacity to find straightforward and simple solutions. Sarcasm was also accompanied by wit. In a typewritten letter sent from Naples to UNHCR in 1958, Bosnian refugee Alija explained that he had fled Yugoslavia in 1957 and arrived in Trieste, where he caught Asiatic flu. And he recounted a series of unhelpful and aggressive responses from doctors in Naples. Why are you coming here so often? Said one doctor. And one doctor said, the best advice I can give you is to stop smoking. Which was really difficult for me, as I am a non-smoker. So not everything can be reduced to mere constraint and subordination. Granted, the case files were the product of an interaction between unequals. But it's a mistake to think of the refugees as passive bystanders who acquiesced in decisions reached by UNHCR. The case files are full of robust exchanges between refugees and officials. The refugee was a protagonist, not on an equal footing, but a protagonist nevertheless. So I now want to say something more about UNHCR's perspectives. It obviously made observations about the status of refugees. We recognize this person is not eligible. But the files reflect much more besides. Staff members made numerous observations about the character of refugees, including judgments based upon their class origin. Referring in 1954 to a 54-year-old Hungarian refugee, the case officer stressed the extremely primitive character of this refugee, who is an agricultural worker. But there are plenty of case files in which refugees of an equally modest background spoke several languages. A Turkish-born refugee, for example, in a case file from 1971, worked as a mechanic and was doing odd jobs. He spoke Turkish, Greek, French, Arabic, and some English. Frequent casual comments were also made about moral conduct, promiscuity or prostitution, divorce, illegitimacy, as well as not managing one's finances and getting into debt. There are also numerous applications that the office described as, quote, mental cases, usually but not always referring to women, and a diagnosis, if such it can be called, that deserves separate treatment. I'm happy to talk more about that. I did want to say, however, that along with the numerous cases where people applied and were rebuffed, were turned down as being ineligible, for example, because they weren't outside the country of nationality and continued to enjoy its protection, there are cases in which UNHCR provided a more generous interpretation of its mandate. I've got time for just one example, which I read quite recently. A 44-year-old Colombian refugee, Rafael, a journalist, an author, who fled from Colombia to Mexico, then to Cuba, and eventually reached Belgium in 1967. He'd become a member of the liberal opposition movement in Colombia in the late 1940s, associated with Jorge Ayala, whose assassination in 1948 set off a decade of violence in which several of Rafael's friends had been jailed or killed. He himself had taken up arms before being arrested and tortured in 1949. Thanks to rich family members who used those connections with those in power, he managed to get to Lima, where he stayed until 1953. He then spent years traveling, including in Cuba in 1959 to 1962. He then returned to Colombia and again joined the guerrilla movement. And then in 1966, he traveled to Europe for medical treatment via a complicated route that took him through Central America. His refugee status in 1967 seemed weak until the legal advisor agreed with its Belgian branch office that, quote, the events to which reference is made took place before the 1st of January 1951, and the refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution. In other words, the convention, the 1951 convention, which said this applies to those who were refugees before the 1st of January 1951. Anyone afterwards, we have to sort of think again. But this is the restriction that it placed. And they said, well, this is the late 1960s, this is 15 years later. But the events that were the kind of foundation of his persecution predate 1951. Why did they decide to stretch a point? Was it because his opposition activities were confined to journalism, which seems a very liberal interpretation, given his admission that he took part in the armed struggle? Were the lawyers convinced by his remarks about the campaign for social reform in Colombia, inspired, as he put it, by the liberal philosophy of the 19th century? Was this that kind of struck a chord with Geneva? Or perhaps they were impressed by his family connections. But in any event, Geneva was prepared to argue in his favour. I want also to say something about statelessness, because this is an issue where there's a lot of interesting work being done around the concept and its and how to address it. What I think I can have space to do is to suggest how refugees themselves, advocated imaginative solutions. So we go from the realm of international law, as it were, to the world of refugees themselves. Here's an instance of what I mean. March 1953. Hungarian merchant seaman, lots of case files of merchant seamen. In this case, János explained that he left the country of his birth, Hungary, in 1948, found work in Denmark without difficulty, but 5 years later, he was jobless and destitute. And he went on. As I, am in connection with many in the same situation as me, suffering under the weight of the stigma stateless DP. And I understand fully the state of mind of my fellow prisoners between the various iron curtains existing all over the world, ready to commit even foolishness in order to belong to a state. I propose that their sufferances be brought to an end by letting them cooperate in building up a state of their own, in the form of a reservation in inverted commas, a reservation following the noble example of the United States of America, where by constitution there was given a place to the Indians under the sun. I have many other practical ideas for solving the question of the refugees. With a final flourish, he wrote, "The moment has arrived to do something radically to solve the unbearable situation of the ever-growing number of stateless intellectuals," his words, placing himself in that category by virtue of his ideas for resolving their status. And then there are other surprises about statelessness. Consider this, for example. 1960, 38-year-old Edward, described in the case files as nationality American, Negro. Another merchant seaman employed by the US Coast Guard who entered the United Arab Republic, Egypt, and renounced his American citizenship and asked for refugee status. The UNHCR refused to pay for his passage to Switzerland, as he requested, because it ruled he didn't come within the mandate. It is true, said UNHCR, that an American citizen abroad can, if he makes a formal renunciation of nationality before a diplomatic or consular officer of the United States, in a prescribed form, lose his nationality. This may make him stateless, but it doesn't make him a refugee. It's a case file where nothing more was put on paper. But then you go online, start to dig in other source material. And this produces further information not on file. It attracted the attention of a US newspaper, which reported Edward's statement, quote, "Dogs have more freedom in the United States than colored Americans," and quoted him praising Colonel Nasser, quote, "because he made me free." So what I do kind of methodologically at this point is to say, here are the case files, but it's possible to, as it were, root around in other sources and to find, if not an outcome, then at least ways in which some cases garnered greater publicity. Now, I think I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm going to cut one passage and go on to say something about human rights. Because here, again, I think what we can say is that the case files disclose evidence in which refugees knew of and wanted to assert their rights as they wrote to Geneva. Consider, for example, 28-year-old Biafran refugee. Okay, so this is in the midst of the civil war in Nigeria. 1969, Christian wrote from The Hague to explain why he couldn't return to Nigeria and why he qualified for recognition. He'd gone to the Soviet Union in 1964 to embark on a law degree. But by this stage, 1969, he had no news of his family. "I left the country at a time when there was no conflict, no traces, with a view to go back on graduation, to serve my country and people. But since the outbreak of the present Nigeria-Biafra war, I've never had any letters from them or traces of their whereabouts." All he could do was to quote from letters he received from friends in Nigeria, describing army massacres and persecution. What's noteworthy about his case was his use of eyewitness testimony and knowledge of refugee law to support his claim for recognition. He stressed, "I have a strong fear of persecution, which in my opinion I consider well-founded." This is precisely the language of the convention. "I consider well-founded from the facts reaching me, since by race I am an Igbo, Biafran by nationality, a Christian by religion, and above all a professor of the Biafran cause. Because of the tragic events at home, I cannot avail myself of the protection of my country. Neither can I be helped by my government while abroad. Because of the above reasons, I cannot go home now. Through my studies, my country and Africa as a whole will benefit more in the long run. So it's precisely his incomplete legal training, his knowledge of the Refugee Convention, gave him precisely the right formula to address UNHCR about his status. And he deftly combined his clear statement with a demonstration of his devotion to the Biafran cause, to the reconstruction of Nigeria, as well as his sense of personal anguish. So other refugees directly raised the issue of human rights or indicated they'd been persecuted for defending those rights. In addition to communist persecution, which is all over the case files, communist persecution, we also find evidence from other quarters. In December 1967, Kurdish refugee Omar wrote from Stockholm to explain that he had been imprisoned in Syria for his activities in support of Kurdish rights. He'd left for Western Europe 5 years earlier. Now he was, as he said, on the verge of starvation. I would not have liked to bother you, he wrote, with such a personal matter, had it not reached such tragical and disastrous limits. The Syrian government is pursuing very discriminatory and repressive measures against the Kurds, which makes it impossible for me to return. It is true that I cannot be classified as an international refugee in the strictest legal sense. But many of us Kurds, whether from Syria, Iraq, Turkey, or Iran, live under such circumstances that are unparalleled anywhere. But no government has felt generous yet to raise our problem at the United Nations. UNHCR's legal team, not surprisingly, restated its position. The problem of Kurds in Syria is not one of our concern. And Mr. S's original letter doesn't contain sufficient information to reach a positive conclusion. So UNHCR did not intervene in this case. But again, what one is impressed by is Omar pressing his claim, even as he knew that international refugee law held out little hope of redress. So one final section, and then I shall conclude. Durable solutions, which is a kind of mantra of UNHCR now. UNHCR's reach extended beyond its original European remit. And it did so frequently by invoking the formula of what was called good offices. And this is the High Commissioner exercises humanitarian concern for refugees as a purely humanitarian device. And you find this, for example, in what happened with Algerian refugees who moved to Tunisia and Morocco in the 1950s. But the issue of individual and group recognition gained still greater prominence in the wake of upheavals in sub-Saharan Africa. According to what B.S. Chimney has called the myth of difference, the view gained ground within the international refugee regime that non-European refugees needed to be deterred and contained, rather than resettled in a third country, as happened to their European counterparts. And this myth of difference was already being articulated in the 1960s. Indeed, in 1961, High Commissioner Schneider specified a difference, as he saw it, between European refugees and what he called new refugees. The distinction arose in this instance in respect of refugees from Angola, where, in Schneider's view, it was impossible to ascertain whether they had crossed an international frontier, sort of sine qua non of being recognized under the convention. But his successor, Sadruddin Aga Khan, insisted that African refugees faced identical challenges and needs: travel permits, the resources to travel for study or for work. They were not, in other words, inhabiting an entirely different realm from Europeans. But nevertheless, the case files support the argument, but by the late 1960s, UNHCR was espousing ideas of containment in response to situations in Africa and endorsing projects for local development. So local development is good because refugees can be helped in Tanzania or wherever it might be. But in cases where it hoped to support resettlement, UNHCR could do nothing to change the stance of prospective countries of immigration, such as when the US immigration authorities denied entry to refugees who'd been members of the Communist Party, even when such membership had been a sine qua non to get a job in their country of origin, such as Romania or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. But what happened when resettlement went sour? All I can say at this stage is that there are lots of case files in which East European refugees who'd been resettled, found, in other words, a durable solution, found that their experiences soured. Yugoslav refugee Ivan wrote from Melbourne in 1961, describing Australia as a truly miserable free world, where, like other emigrants, we're far hungrier than we'd been in our country of origin, and he resolved to return to Yugoslavia. Do not be offended, he wrote, but this is how it is, and God will judge you all. There is no Christianity in the West, and it should not come as a surprise that you are judged by those in the East. But understandably, here we find that little publicity was given to these cases, which undermined the West's claim to offer a successful path to integration. So to sum up, case files underline centrality of population displacement in the history of the 20th century, illuminate the activity and reach of a major intergovernmental institution, which operated with an agreed mandate, but had to listen to what refugees said. We can track the UNHCR learning process, its rejection of claims from those it deemed to be outside the mandate, its cooperation with voluntary agencies, its principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, but also its room for manoeuvre. And what, therefore, does this historical material have to say to the present? In one sense, it supports what former UNHCR staff member Jeff Crisp has lately written, that UNHCR, quote, finds it difficult to cope with situations in which refugees speak up for themselves and criticize the organization that claims to represent their interests. Key questions around authority, accountability, and trust persist. The case files do little to indicate that UNHCR was accountable to refugees. From that point of view, it adopted a conservative rather than a progressive stance. What are the perspectives of refugees? In different contexts, at different times, they put their views across, described their experiences, even as they found themselves treated as a problem and a case. They protested at decisions that went against them, even though their options were limited. But nevertheless, just making their presence felt could be transformative for the individual, even if they got nowhere, and even if as they disappear from view, they forced Geneva to respond. Sometimes they even had the final word, and it seems therefore appropriate to conclude with the remarks of a refugee. In August 1967, the daughter of an aged Armenian refugee wrote to High Commissioner Sadruddin to thank him for his intervention in helping her father secure his pension. Quote, I must confess, I never expected that you would take such immediate action on my father's case. My gratitude, as well as my family's, I'm sure, can't be expressed in words. She could now concentrate on her degree studies, and she concluded with a personal flourish. It's interesting to know that you are now the High Commissioner for Refugees, and I wish you the best of luck in your high mission. If there's anything I can do or anyone I can help with my humble capacities, I should be more than willing to do so. Maybe Sadruddin agreed with her that he needed the best of luck. In any event, her letter found its way into the case files as an indication that, whether positive or disappointing, encounters with UNHCR could leave an indelible impression on officials and refugees alike. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this fascinating and insightful talk. And I have the pleasure today to be the discussant. and I will keep my comments brief in order to leave enough time for discussions and questions, of which I'm sure there are many today. So my comments are based both on your talk right now, but also your paper, your article that appeared in 2021. And so let me just begin by saying that Peter Gatrell's talk and the corresponding article contributes to three related fields of refugee history, I would argue. So first, it serves as a methodological as well as ethical reflection on the use of case files or of the case file as a historical source. Second, it expands on our understanding of the practices of refugee administrations on the ground level, and thus to a more holistic view of the international refugee regime during the 20th century. And three, it emphasizes the importance of studying refugee voices and the agency they exerted despite the many constraints that they were faced with. And this call to move away from simple top-down perspectives and to include the experiences of refugees themselves when writing their history is not necessarily new, but it nevertheless took some time before historians started to really base their research around refugee voices. And one reason for this delayed response has to do with the availability of sources, which has long been quite limited. Another has to do with the fact that refugee history is still an emerging field. Recent years, however, have seen many advances in this direction, and I'm thinking here, for example, of Ruth Baylind, who was one of the first to analyze the IRO's CM1 files in terms of what they can tell us about refugees' agency, their knowledge and strategies for navigating the international refugee regime during the immediate post-war years. And her work was followed by many other studies and publications, one of which is also the widely cited article by yourself and your team on refugeedom and refugee voices in modern history from 2021. And so on this question of refugee voices, I would like to make two observations in connection with the talk. So firstly, I was struck by a certain prevalent ambiguity regarding the role of the UNHCR. And I mean that in the sense that both the refugees and UNHCR officers were seemingly still learning sort of the rules of the regime, and many of the interactions you described seem to run after more of a certain makeshift basis instead of clear rules that were set up. So on the one hand, officers did not always know if or how they were supposed to help, same as the refugees did not always know if UNHCR was actually the agencies that could help them, or they simply did not care. This did not keep them from trying, however, as you described, and this, I guess it's a testament to their will and that they continue to do so, even if they technically did not fall under the mandate of the UN. And as we've seen, or as you have argued, these encounters in turn influenced the practices of the officers. So there's a certain form of negotiation going on. A second observation has to do with narrative conventions and the tone that refugees assumed when addressing the officers. And I was surprised to see how they adapted to political narratives or language of their time, be it in terms of anti-communist rhetoric, anti-colonial sentiment, or in the language of human rights. And this is also consistent with the pre-UNHCR period. So example, under the IRO, when displaced persons expressed their anti-Nazi or anti-communist sentiments in order to be resettled overseas. And so I'd like to end with two questions, which might afterwards serve to open up the discussion. So the first question, and this is something that I encountered in my own work on the IRO case files, has to do with the selection of case files found in the archive, or the sample. This is something that you describe also or develop more in your article. where you mention that your sample is not representative, and this is of course the case for many reasons. So for one, we don't know which files were kept, which were destroyed, and after which logic this happened. So already there has been a selection made for us. And additionally, and often frustratingly for us historians, files only contain fragments. Often they end abruptly. Sometimes they contain only a few documents or bureaucratic notes. Which is why when we want to analyze them, we tend to focus on those files which contain a certain amount, a minimal amount of material, from which we can actually see the interactions between refugees and refugee officers, as well as being able to reconstruct, if only partially, their life stories. So my question is, what influence does this have on our perception of these interactions? So is this selection biased towards the more problematic cases, in inverted commas, that create bigger paper trails than good encounters, in the sense that they would leave less documents in the files because they were wrapped up more quickly? And what does this mean for our analysis? And the second question has to do with the gender dimension of what you described. You mentioned that women are generally underrepresented in the files. And you did talk about a case, and I would like you to maybe expand, if you could maybe expand on that. So I was wondering, in what way did UNHCR address women differently than they did men, or how did women address UNHCR differently with their stories? If we can draw any conclusions from that. So those would be my question. Thank you very much.
Maybe you can stay here and answer those questions, and then we will open the floor to Q&A. Is that okay?
Okay, fine. Well, thank you very much, Ramon, for those great questions and comments. I'm particularly glad that you responded. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the camera right here, but hello, camera. Particularly glad that you wanted to raise the whole question of ethics, because it's something that I do wrestle with a great deal at the time. And I know enough about contemporary refugee studies to realise that this is not just a question for historians, obviously. It's a question of everyday scholarly practice for anthropologists and sociologists and so forth. But it is something that continues to exercise me in relation to looking at the historical material. And it's compounded in a way by the realization that you have a document, you have a file. And as you rightly say, this file, and it's no doubt true of the IRO material as well, tells you a certain about, but not everything. And you want to know, because you're a historian and you're inquisitive, so what happened next? And then the internet comes into play. And here am I in Geneva looking at case files, preserving, respecting anonymity. But either curiosity gets the better of you, and you want to Google the name of someone and see what happens. Or indeed, something at least as interesting happens, which is that the case file includes newspaper clippings, because this case became a public cause célèbre. So in a way, the case is in the public domain because it is reported in an American newspaper or in the international media. So it's already out there. So what do I do? If I say, I've come across an interesting article about person X in some obscure newspaper, in the 1960s, people saying, well, how does he come to know about, does he read every, county newspaper that's ever been published in the 1950s or the 1960s? And the answer, the upfront answer is because it's in the case files. But then one is already saying, well, if you go and look at the Times newspaper, you can read all about the case and the person is no longer anonymous. So it's a big kind of issue, a big conundrum as far as I'm concerned. I'm very glad that Ramon mentioned the work of Ruth Ballint. If you don't know her work on the IRO Destination Elsewhere, it's a really superb piece of work, using the IRO case files to do something very similar to what I'm doing, and disclosing some of the practices of refugees. What are they willing to say? What do they want to disguise? How does UNHCR manage the case file? Bear in mind, Ramon will know of this, but the IRO in 1947 created what's called an eligibility manual, a manual for eligibility officers, which is a big kind of volume of case files, essentially, which it edited bit by bit. So it would say, here are these expellees from Eastern Europe. They do not fall under the mandate for this and this reason, even though this person has said they were persecuted in this and this respect. And that manual from 1947 was handed over to UNHCR, which didn't update it until the early 1960s. So I think one of the things that I'm yet to work my way through is the extent to which these UNHCR people had this eligibility manual as a kind of Bible for reference by their side, which I think helps to engage with one of your questions, which is about the fact that UNHCR was creating a body of precedent. I mean, that's why these case files were of interest. And Ramon is actually absolutely right that you're kind of, what's the word, impressed or frustrated by the fact that for all that there are 25,000 case files, 25,000 case files, what happened to the ones that didn't make it? But even more interesting, what happened to the refugees who didn't make it? They didn't write to the High Commission. Yeah? Writing to the High Commission or to somebody else like Eleanor Roosevelt or Yul Brynner is a choice. What are the considerations that go through the mind of a refugee who, as it were, has completely given up hope? There's that. I'm just reading a book by John Berger at the moment, which has a passage about Geneva. He's not very complimentary about historians. He says, forget about the archives. You want to just pound the streets of Geneva. But he has a phrase that I rather like, in which he says, many suffer from hopefulness. It's not hopelessness. It's hopefulness that hopefulness can kill you, really. That's something that's stuck in my mind. Now, just before I finish, gender. I mean, this is something I'm incredibly conscious of trying to do justice to. There are gender dimensions within UNHCR. It's not the case, and you'll have to correct me about the IRO. I mean, it's not the case that UNHCR was a male-only world, because amongst the key figures who recur, you write to this person who deals with your case, there are 2 or 3 women who really have an important role to play in the whole eligibility process. Some of them legal, some of them resettlement officers, and they don't seem to me to be subordinate in any way to the men. Although, of course, as is well known, in its lifetime since 1951, there's only ever been 1 woman High Commissioner at UNHCR. But I think the other point I'd like to make is that, although I haven't quoted them, there are case files in which one is incredibly impressed by the determination of women to find partners or children where they've been lost, or have kept households together in situations of conflict. For example, during the Chinese Civil War, one case sticks in my mind. Or how, I sort of hesitate to mention this, but on my last visit to Geneva, I was kind of completely taken aback, which is a case of a woman, I think Polish, if I remember rightly, who was a forced labourer, so it became a DP, displaced person, after 1945. And she wrote to the High Commission in the 1960s, so something like 20 years after the events that she's about to describe. And she names her rapist, the German farmer on whose farm she was billeted. And she talks in brief about how she wants to try and get this man brought to justice. So she names him and she says, recounts the moments and the place. And UNHCR says, well, you're not a refugee. We can't help. We're very sympathetic. And you should press your case with the German courts. But it's so long after the events that we don't hold out any hope. I cite this because there are case files, not just involving women, but also involving men, where what's at stake is a clear case of sexual abuse, harassment, or outright rape. I think UNHCR is kind of taken aback, or is a bit wonders how do we handle these kinds of cases. I haven't myself come to a clear view about this, but the reason I mention it is to say that, to return to a point I made in general, the case files talk about so much more than about the immediate background to one's displacement. It's a rather crass thing to say, but there was an English newspaper that's gone bust, which said that all human life is here. And there's something about that in the case files, that there's a kind of richness along with the kind of factual statements. There's a kind of richness of human experience that is kind of very striking and compelling. As the specific question, were women addressed differently than men? No, I don't think so. Although there is this preponderance of women who appear in the mental cases heading. And I think this goes back to, kind of deep-seated masculinized ideas of what constitutes hysteria. Thinking of the work of the late Showalter and the literature on hysteria in the late early 20th century. But then at the same time, you read some of these case files and you say, forget hysteria, this person's really mad. You could just read it in the blue handwriting, the blue ink, and the pages and pages that just are kind of manic. But I mean, you still have to treat these seriously, it seems to me, rather than dismiss it. It's a case of I think it's a Hungarian guy who writes from Australia, says, I've been bombarded with X-rays by the Australians, and here are my teeth as evidence. He sends his dentures to Geneva and says, please examine my dentures, and you'll find that these have been exposed. I've been exposed to X-rays against my will. I mentioned that partly because it's filed away as mad, but also because the dentures don't exist in the case files. I mean, and that's interesting because the case files are basically paper. I'd love to find, lots of photographs, not just passport photographs. I'd love to find more poems, more stories, but you don't. Not even dentures.
you very much. So I think we should maybe open, and I also already see Geneva.
Thank you for this presentation. I would like to come back really to your last sentence, because my question would be, how do you make sense of all these stories? How do you shape maybe a pattern out of them in order to tell the story, which basically combines the stories to the story? I was thinking of listening to you, I was thinking of Hannah Arendt's Origin of Totalitarianism and the chapter on the rights to have rights, which has also a very skeptical view on the creation of an international organization, the UN, and also the protection of human rights. And she was telling the story of the situation after World War I, about the experience of those who were stateless, about the migrants, about the incapacity to have a protection. And basically, and her narrative has been there is no protection for them unless there is a state who's protecting them. And I was thinking, okay, your narrative starts after the Second World War. And what do we get from this Cold War experience of 51 to the 70s? What is there, basically, the lessons can draw from all these stories which you have inquired?
That's the kind of question that keeps me awake at night, because I cannot get enough of the stories at the moment, partly because there are so many, and you turn over the file and you hope to find, as it were, a killer file that is not just presenting a case in a very abbreviated or attenuated form, but which is a kind of 100-page autobiography. I would love to find that, but I haven't. But I keep on searching, probably in vain, in the hope that I'll come across that. What that means is that you would not believe, or perhaps you would believe, how many, well, more than 200,000 words I have written, drawing upon these individual case files, in which I'm trying to create a kind of structured account. That means that there are certain sorts of, if you like, chapters that were almost right themselves, when one looks, for example, at the case of refugees who present with issues of disability, particularly physical disability. Or one can imagine a chapter that relates to category I mentioned, which is that of refugee seamen who were kind of, if you like, a curiosity, but kind of energized UNHCR as well. I don't have an adequate answer to your question, but I think where I began has led me in the direction of saying that this has to be a history in which refugees emerge as a category of concern and portray themselves in a way that, as it were, legitimizes to themselves why they are a category of concern, and how UNHCR then responds. That's why I'm beginning to favor the idea of an encounter, because if it's not an encounter, it's the refugees' voices which are kind of suspended almost in midair. They're kind of they're decontextualized, not necessarily depoliticized, but they're decontextualized. They only become significant when they produce a record of an encounter with UNHCR and the response. So, but that response can go in different sorts of directions, and that still leaves me with the problem that you pose, except that in Arendtian terms, obviously, I say obviously, but many refugees and UNHCR accept the idea of a durable solution, which means resettlement and therefore, for want of a better term, integration in a state that protects them, and welfare, education, all the rest of it. So that is a solution. Sometimes the solution comes unstuck, as I said towards the end. But I'm also impressed by the ways in which refugees can go off message and say, this is how you want me to behave, or this is how you want me to conform. But what about if we imagine the world in a different sort of way? So I have found more than one example of refugees who say, this is what a utopian kind of world would look like. Maybe a world in which there are no refugees, maybe a world in which there are no states. So I think, granted the power of what Arendt says, that doesn't mean that we should always be looking for that kind of solution, when often what the case files are doing is to talk about indeterminacy, as it were, something provisional rather than something permanent. But I wrestle precisely with the kind of question about how you manage this enormous amount of material.
Yeah, maybe I might like to come back, coming from there, but might come back to remark that Ramon made about but the question is what did they learn? I mean, Ramon said that there was a great deal of knowledge of missing knowledge from the side of the refugees, but also from the side of the officers who didn't really know what was the adequate solution, what to propose, what to suggest, what were the rules. So all was in the making, if I understood you right, and that I follow Ramon. And maybe there is a story to tell about that, who learned, what was the learning process. And from there, I would like to ask what can you know from the files about what people knew about UNHCR? From where did they get the information? I mean, we would just Google, but what did they know? The refugees know. They refer to the Refugee Convention after the beginning of the 50s. So, how were they informed? How were they keeping informed? And what do the files allow to say about the learning processes of both the refugees and the officers?
Absolutely key questions. I think to deal with this and to pick up the point that you and Ramon both made, I think one of the things that comes across through the case files, which are not organised chronologically, they're organised alphabetically by family name, is that UNHCR, when it's established, was established in expectation of certain kinds of, if you like, problems being prominent. Legacy problems such as the revolution, the Armenian genocide, or the Spanish Civil War, and then things happen that are perhaps not to be massive great surprise, the results of communist rule in Eastern Europe, refugees. But I think one of the things that comes across from the case files is the moments at which UNHCR, as it were, sits up and takes notice of things it did not expect to find. So in that sense, there is a learning process because, oh my goodness, what's happening in Rwanda in 1959 through to 1962, or what's happening in Zanzibar in the 1960s, the persecution of Arab merchants after the revolution in Tanzania, and Zanzibar refugees who end up in the Gulf states. So there's kind of the learning process is a process of adjustment to the unexpected, which was never anticipated. How could it be in 1951? So I think that's one answer to the question, is that rule making or procedure responds to circumstances that are sometimes thrown up in unexpected ways. Now, when you ask about how do refugees get their information, of course, one of the things that's interesting in the case files is that obviously lots of letters are addressed to UNHCR Geneva or to a branch office of UNHCR. But then you also find, as I mentioned, that people do not know whom to address. So they send it in the direction of where they think it's most likely to get a response. Send it to, there's something called the United Nations in Geneva. I'll just send it to the United Nations Geneva. That's what's on the envelope. And eventually gets routed to Geneva. Or refugees who get it wrong in the sense that they're still writing to the International Refugee Organization in 1960, even though it's more than 10 years ago, being disbanded. But then I'm also impressed by the way in which refugees know exactly what to say and to whom to say it. And the answer to that is partly because they've been educated in programs of law, or they have met together and used their networks in refugee camps or other kinds of institutions where the knowledge is being shared. So I think there's maybe it goes back to the previous question about one of the ways of kind of marshalling or disciplining all this knowledge, all this material, is to think about knowledge acquisition and knowledge sharing, which is certainly going on. And if I could just make one other point related to that, these are described as individual case files, individual case files. And of course, that's why they exist. They're called IC as individual case. But that doesn't mean that they're all about individuals. People will articulate a case on behalf of others. They'll act as a spokesperson. Or, as I said in the paper, they will portray themselves as representing a broader constituency. So I think we also have to bear in mind that individuals are sometimes, as it were, take it upon themselves to do more than to raise their own particular circumstances, but to speak on behalf of a broader group. I think we could take time for the questions. Just
one more question. Your time span is 1951, 1975. I was wondering if you see any trace of the 1967 protocol.
You do. So the reference here is to the extension of the original convention in 1967. Yes, there is reference to this, but it tends to be oblique rather than foregrounded. That is to say, I can't think of any case files offhand in which a refugee writes and says, "Hey, Geneva, things have changed now in 1967. Here I am. Please take note of me." It's possible, and I keep an eye out for that. But I haven't seen it, as opposed to seeing, as it were, other UNHCR files where it's obviously talked about a great deal more. If I could, however, just add a note to that, which is to say that the 1969 convention, agreed by the Organization of African Unity, certainly does figure quite prominently in the case files. And the whole question of UNHCR's relationship with the OAU emerges quite nicely in some case files. If I could just give one illustration of this, there's a case file in which a guy, forgive me, I can't remember from where, but ends up in Europe, marries a French woman, and says, "I'm not going back. I've qualified, but I'm going to carry on working in Europe." And the OAU says, gets wind of this case and says, "This is disastrous. If all refugees from sub-Saharan Africa who end up in Europe to get qualifications are going to stay there, what does this do to the development of sub-Saharan Africa?" And UNHCR says, "Well, sorry, this we can't, as it were, undermine this guy's individual wishes to stay in Europe." So there's kind of pressure point there between the OAU and UNHCR.
Last question. So I would have another question, or I don't know if it's a comment, but it's about the files and the fact that what I imagine, I haven't seen them, but you only get a glimpse of a biography in a very moment, so you don't know, I think, what's coming after that, and not maybe before that, but maybe some more information about that, but you don't get what people are going to be later on. And my reflection is that might be a very good thing also, because if you know you have this kind of biographical idea, then you get into all those you get to relativize. Knowing that they got integrated and married and then could stay on in France, or I don't know, you get to say, okay, this very moment of flight was difficult but resolved. But if you don't know that you're very much staying in you're getting more of what they are feeling, what pain they are in, what fears that they have. So I imagine I'm working on files together with Magali from children who came to Switzerland in the same period as hidden children from migrant workers, and we have those files who you don't know how they end, and I think it's a very good thing, even if you would like to write all those biographies, but yeah, for knowing more what they felt, what was really the important thing of the moment, it's really a good thing to have those unresolved.
Thank you. I should say that I'm not sure whether I'm going to include it in the book eventually, but I am working on another book with my project team around reckoning with refugeedom, and we have a chapter devoted to the emotions of refugeedom. And one of the things that I'm trying to work out is that emotion is an integral part of the Refugee Convention. If you think about it, the Refugee Convention talks about someone being recognised who has a well-founded fear of persecution. Not just who is persecuted, but feels it, so it's visceral. You know? And so how does one deal with the fact that you have to demonstrate fear? Now, if you go to the contemporary literature in the work of Fassin and others, it's all about psychiatric evaluation, or it's about physical marks of torture on the body, and here is the evidence that you present to the tribunal. With the case files, it's rhetoric more than anything else. But I'm telling you the truth. You must believe me, and I can find other people who will vouch for me, who will back up my story. And it's a story of suffering, and that is something that constitutes my fear. But in terms of the later biography, there are other dimensions, emotional dimensions to the case files, which is where people say, thank you. I mean, there are plenty of case files that end with letters or cards written to the High Commissioner or to other people, which simply say it's taken a long time. Some of these case files will last for decades, 2 decades. And write saying at last I've been helped and it's been worth it and thank you. So there's the kind of emotional dimension that has to do with expressions of relief and gratitude. But then I come back to the staff members, the eligibility officers. Do they go home at night and sleep easily? They go home and say, job well done. Do they go home and say, I've done things by the book. Here's the eligibility manual. Right, this case is open and shut. I couldn't have done anything better. And I haven't let my emotions get in the way. Even though this German expellee has talked about her family circumstances, no, I keep my emotions in check. Okay, but so there's the emotional realm of the eligibility of the officers, of the staff members as well. Are they restrained? Are they good lawyers, inverted commas, or do they spend time, having coffee with other eligibility officers and saying, this is a difficult case. Can we maybe just stretch it a point? Can we be a bit more flexible? So writing the emotions of refugees, seems to me, is partly writing about refugees, but it's also, again, writing about the encounter of the missions.
So again, thank you very much.